This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Barnett Mechanical, a full-service design build firm specializing in turnkey process and utility systems for the brewing industry. You know beer. We know breweries.
Hops have enzymes that are capable of breaking down starch or dextrins, turning them into fermentable sugars. And as long as you've got yeast around, you're going to get alcohol production, CO2, decrease in specific gravity. It's very clear that this phenomenon was very well known in 1893, and it was, in fact, one of the reasons that people dry hopped was to sort of, dry out the beer a little bit and increase the alcohol and so on.
This week on the show, dry hop creep, aka the freshening power of hops. Now, here's our guests.
Hi, this is Tom Shellhammer. I'm professor at Oregon State University.
Yeah, Jason Perkins, brewmaster at Allagash Brewing Company.
Hi, Luke Chadwick, senior scientist at Bell's Brewery.
Hi, I'm Andy Farrell. I'm the brewing innovation manager at Bell's Brewery. Yeah, sure. So I guess my involvement in this whole thing, really, it was when Luke was quality manager and I was our brew house manager. We basically, through looking at a lot of beer analysis, noticed that there was something going on with the ABVs of our beers.
And how long ago was this?
Really, it started in earnest probably 7 years ago.
Okay.
2011.
2011. And in some ways, there had been some things going on even prior to that. But in 2011, basically because of our process and when we would analyze beers, we would see beers that would, essentially what we call flatline. So the fermentation would stop. And then we would run one more analytical test before package to ensure compliance. And when we'd look at that beer, the beer would move.
Right.
And it would move sometimes pretty significantly with AE dropping, sometimes a pretty significant, in a variable way, but in sometimes very significant way. And ABVs would move, and occasionally they would move in a way where it would cause action from the brewery because we may get knocked out of a compliant range on a beer.
I assume very few people were talking about this, that many years ago. Did it take you a while to put two and two together to look at hops, or was that something that kind of, clicked fairly quickly?
So I think for us, we knew that there was something to dry hop beers drying out a little more. That was something that we knew. We didn't know why or exactly everything that was going on. It's complicated. There's a lot going on there. We always back then we would attribute it to mixing that would happen. Like you'd add the hops and you'd cause a bunch of agitation in the beer and kind of get everything going again. We talked about glycosides for a while as a potential reason. Luke, do you want to talk about hop creep? Was something that you talked to somebody about a number of years ago as well?
So basically for me, this really, this came on the radar at the same time as for Andy around 2011. And that's when we were getting really serious about ABV compliance and really sort of tightening our belts, becoming the sort of larger brewery that we've become. And most of our beers were very well under control from an ABV compliance standpoint, but it was the dry hopped beers that were certainly just more variable, and we run into cases where we couldn't ship it. It's out of compliance.
So how did you address it? What did you start to, how did you start to tackle that problem?
So many times over those years, I attempted different types of literature searches. I just assumed someone must have looked at this, because it became apparent to us, so after not too much time, that this is a real effect. It's not a small effect. It's big enough to certainly to notice if you're paying attention. And I just kept talking myself out of jumping into the lab and trying different stuff, because I figured I'd find a starting point, and I really never found anything, and until it was just about a year ago, when it was Andy. I'm not sure if it was Andy or John ran into Jason at an MBAA conference somewhere, and we're discussing this. Long story short, a conference call was set up. I got to participate in that conference call, and we were essentially just kind of telling each other stories about our experiences with this dry hop creep. And it was in that conference call that they turned me on to this paper from 1941 out of England, and it had the phrase hop diastase. Hops, and then diastase, like the diastatic power. Coming out of that meeting with Jason and Tom Shellhammer, with this sort of new intel, there's this concept, hop diastase. I Googled that, and some months before that, apparently Google had scanned and archived and added to Google Books, essentially like all of the UC Davis brewing library, 75 years old and older. All the old brewing books from UC Davis is now an unbelievable resource currently available through books.google.com. Anyway, searched that in Google, stumbled across this paper from 1893 by Horace Brown and Harris Morris, who I didn't know, but I've learned since then that these are pioneers in plant physiology and just how enzymes work, how photosynthesis works. These were some of the most important scientists in the history of plant research, and it so happened that they looked at this very particular problem. And in 1893, they went into it with a similar sort of set of questions that we had, in 2011 through 2017, essentially like what could it be? And they sort of broke it down to, I think, four things. It could be simply that hops have fermentable sugars, and when you add hops to beer, you're just adding sugar, and that explains it. They quickly ruled that out. They also proposed the thought that maybe hops have wild yeast on them, and that it's wild yeast that's responsible for maybe breaking down dextrins and doing some after fermentation. You really have to read the original Brown and Morris work to get a sense for how prolific, how much time they spent on this. But you really get a feel from their text that they were very familiar with wild yeast, and this was not wild yeast. It had just a very different behavior. Wild yeast takes weeks, if not months, to really sort of rear its ugly head, whereas this is almost instantaneous. That same day you start to see activity after dry hopping. So they ruled out that hops has fermentable sugars. They ruled out wild yeast. Then the third one, that hops have enzymes that are capable of breaking down starch or dextrins, turning them into fermentable sugars. And as long as you've got yeast around, you're going to get alcohol production, CO2, decrease in specific gravity. And they, in 1893, did a pretty remarkable job, by the standards of the time of I don't want to say proving that, but they left very little doubt that the cause of what we know as hop creep. I should mention that this term, the freshening power of the hop, comes from Brown and Morris's work. They, in this 1893 paper, they wrote that phrase a few different times, a few different ways, and really since then we've sort of taken a 180, on this and try to see it as a positive thing. When you read the Brown and Morris work, it's very clear that this phenomenon was very well known in 1893, and it was, in fact, one of the reasons that people dry hopped was to sort of, dry out the beer a little bit and increase the alcohol and so on.
It sounds like they also spent more time coming up with a more elegant term for it than hop creep, which could easily be confused with a cellarman who stares a little too long, or maybe the hop salesman who always drops by unannounced,
I like it. Yes, let's rebrand Hop Creep and refer to this particular thing as the freshening power of the hop. I'm all for it.
Jason, when did you first encounter hop creep?
I think ours is kind of a unique situation where, we at Allagash, we actually don't do a ton of dry hopping in general, where our hop usage is kind of on the lower side in comparison to the majority of craft brewers. But what we do exclusively is we bottle condition everything. And we have from the beginning. So we tend to track that stuff, a couple things really closely. One, extract in the bottle. And CO2 in the bottle, of course. And we track those very closely, extract with alkalizer, and CO2, we actually use a non-destructive selective CO2 meter for testing bottle carbonation. So when we started making a few dry hop beers, we started seeing this weird phenomenon where we would see unexpected attenuation in the bottle. And some to the point where we actually had to dump some beer as a result of it. So we really started digging into it from that perspective. I know the folks at Bell's talked a lot about ABV compliance. We kind of saw it on the CO2 production side when we started making a beer using dry hops. The first time we saw it was probably back in 2015 on a seasonal beer. But really, we started seeing it mostly when we had a new beer that we hit the market with. There was a year-round dry hop beer in 2016.
After you encountered the hop creep phenomenon, you set up an experiment to determine if over-attenuation could be explained by dry hopping. Tell us about that.
Yeah, we sure did. Yeah, our lab manager, our QC manager here, Zach Boda, had this theory. It's basically his theory that he thought something funky was going on with these dry hops and creating an extended fermentation. We have pretty extensive micro work here, so we were quite sure that it wasn't a wild yeast situation. So we dug into it a little closer. So the first thing we did with this beer, which we make year round, called Happy Table Beer, is we took and just wanted to see a kind of on a benchtop whether we would see this effect. So and kind of try to pinpoint the cause. So we started with just a simple control with no treatment to it at all, and monitor the extract over time. We then also added just yeast, so nothing else, and then added yeast and dry hops in treatment 2, and then treatment 3 was just dry hops, and we just monitored the extract over time.
And what'd you see there?
What we saw is in the control, we saw no change in extract. In the treatment where we're just adding some sugar only, we did not see a drop in overall extract after that sugar re-ferments away. In the most interesting thing we saw was by adding dry hops, we saw a pretty significant drop in extract in a relatively short period of time, just in a few days to start, and over time a continual drop in extract from around 4 Plato to below 3.4 Plato, so a pretty significant drop. Saw the same effect when dry hops were added on their own.
And that was, so you're saying you saw the same effect regardless of whether you added sugar and yeast?
Correct.
Yeah. Wow.
Correct. Now it is worth noting that we have there's yeast in solution here. This isn't beer that it is sterile filtered. So there's yeast in solution to do work on these enzymes, right? On the broken down starches.
Okay, that makes sense. So then after that, you did another experiment to find out if the yeast strain, the hop cultivar, and the base beer had any real impact on this over attenuation. Tell us about how you set up that experiment and what you found.
Yeah, to me, the second experiment is kind of the simplest way to kind of explain this phenomenon, and it's something we decided to do in-house using somebody else's beer. So we took a standardized base beer that we knew we could rely on. We chose Coors Banquet beer, obviously a beer that's been made for a long time, and it's very consistent, and it's a very dry beer. We wanted to see what the effect of adding dry hops to that beer in the presence of yeast and without the presence of yeast. So we did an experiment where we took Coors Banquet beer and added varying different yeast strains to it. So I added our house yeast, a secondary, what we call our reserve strain, which is a strain we bottle condition a lot of our beer with, and then just Chico yeast. Those are the 3 yeasts we used. So in half of the experiment, the beer Coors Banquet just simply got yeast added to it. The other 3 got the same yeast strains plus dry hops at about 10 grams per liter. So, a fairly heavy dose of hops at 2.6 pounds per barrel or so. We use Cascade hops, just chose to use a hop that's very commonly used in American craft brew. And then we monitored that extract over time. And what we found was pretty interesting. We saw a very slight drop in extract in all cases except for the control. So our yeast strain we added, we're using Belgian style strains, and then a Chico strain saw a very slight drop in extract. But more importantly and more interestingly, once we took and add dry hops to these, we saw a huge drop in extract.
I'm sure you were talking to other folks in the industry as you were going down this rabbit hole. We've got our friend Tom Shellhammer here. Tom, tell us how you entered the equation.
Yeah, I got an email from Jason maybe in the fall of 2016 or so, I think it was, Jason, sometime, I think about 2 years ago. Yeah. And you described this phenomena to me and said, hey, you want to give this a try in your lab, see what's what? And so I said, sure. So we set up the exact same experiment, number 2, that Jason was just talking about. Got some Coors Banquet beer and had 3 different treatments, Coors by itself, Coors with yeast, Coors with hops, and Coors with hops and yeast. And as we were comparing the data, these are 2 different United States, and the data were just like sitting right on top of each other. So it was pretty remarkable. It was also pretty remarkable to see the extent of this re-fermentation that occurred.
Coming up.
And it appears that when you remove the hops from the beer, that the phenomenon is stopped at that point.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. This episode is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. The Diastaticus Detection Methods and Control Measures webinar is August 1st. District Philly holds its summer meeting at the Pennsylvania Sam Adams Brewery August 3rd. The annual District Texas summer meeting is the weekend of August 3rd in Kerrville. The ASBC MBAA Brewing Summit takes place in San Diego this August. Register at mbaa.com, where you can also view the full calendar of events with more details or find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show.
It was cool on 2 levels. One, just like surprising how much re-fermentation could occur, and that this experiment that was actually a fairly simple one could be reproduced so effectively.
And then you did something. You did some more work after that to try to dig a little deeper into the enzymes, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we've done a number of things, and it kind of started as like a little project, and it's sort of, I don't know, pulling on a thread on a sweater, or peeling back the layers of the onion. It was it seemed pretty clear that there was this what appeared to be hop-derived enzyme activity, and as Luke pointed out, there's some precedent for this. It's just really old precedent, and had kind of gone quiet, of British brewers a century ago finding this re-fermentation in dry hopped cask beers, and so we thought, if we've got enzyme kits that we can use to measure enzymes in malt, maybe we can adapt those to measure enzymes in hops, and it took some work, but we found 4 different enzyme kits that allowed us to verify that there was some activity of alpha amylase, beta amylase, very small amounts. Not very, but small activity levels relative to malt, but still present. And then also, what I think was really surprising is the presence of some amyloglucosidase activities and limit dextranase activities. And the limit dextranase activity was really, really low, but still enough to give us a positive read on this assay. And those last 2 enzymes are important because they can debranch branch dextrins or branch starch. And so it was kind of cool to see that we've got this residual extract in beer that has a quantity of a big portion of the residual extract is made up of unfermentable branch dextrins, unfermentable because the mashing process hasn't broken them down sufficiently, and that there's some debranching activity present in the hops that can further break down those dextrins, and then the alpha and beta amylase coming behind and start producing simple sugars. And so we saw that from an enzyme assay kit, and then we went through and looked at these sugars and dextrins using liquid chromatography and sort of verified just what I described, that you can see the residual extract of Coors Banquet beer degrading in the presence of yeast. I'm sorry, in the presence of hops and in the absence of yeast and of fermentable sugars, mainly maltose, but also some glucose and some maltotriose. And I think what's also interesting is that we've discovered that Coors Banquet's got a low level of maltose and glucose, which sort of surprised me, a residual amount of fermentable sugar in a lager beer. And I asked one of my buddies at Coors, and he said, in his classic state, I can neither confirm nor deny that there's fermentable sugars left behind. But that drop in real extract that Jason saw through the addition of just yeast is the yeast sort of mopping up this residual amount of sugar.
So it makes it so tasty, Tom.
Yeah, I know, exactly. It's kind of like maybe just a low level of sugar is like the MSG of light beer. So who knows?
There you go. So how can a brewer predict whether or not they're going to experience hop creep for a given recipe or hop?
It's kind of, in my opinion, it's kind of vexing because when I talk to various brewers are not unified in how they describe to me the headaches that come from this phenomena. Some brewers say, this is not a problem with me. It's we don't actually see it, and it may be because of the timing of their hop addition. It may actually be occurring, but they don't see it as a 2-stage fermentation or re-fermentation because it's happening simultaneously with the main fermentation. And I'm speculating, but there are other brewers that describe tremendous headaches that come from this. And if anything, the headaches that they say that are even worse are a diacetyl spike that is most likely induced by this re-fermentation. But I'll let the brewers talk about this because they're the guys that are making beer every day.
Yeah, I can start by, what I'll do is I'll explain what we've done because it's a very isolated scenario, but I'll also say that I think the important thing is just for brewers out there to be aware of the phenomenon. Because as Tom said, it really depends on, the way in which you're adding hops, the length of time it's on the hops, the temperature of the hops, whether you're packaging with or without yeast afterwards. So I think, my approach with this has always been just get this information out there because, individual brewers are going to have to make their own individual plans on how to handle this. But it's really important for people to know, especially given the fact that so many people these days are packaging their beer with yeast, some portion of yeast. The days of pad filtration in the craft beer industry aren't gone, but they're not as common as they used to be. So there's some kind of yeast in the majority of craft beer in the package. So if this effect of breakdown of starches happens and you don't let it happen before you put it in the package or are not aware that it's going to happen, there's going to be some dangerous packages on the shelves. And, I've heard anecdotally from a number of brewers like, oh, that's what's been causing this issue for us for all these years. So I think the key is just understanding the phenomenon and then applying that understanding to your given process. I'll say for us specifically, it was really a simple fix. We basically let the reaction happen in the tank. For us, this beer that we saw it with was a new brand for us. So we didn't actually have a true to type per se out there. So we could make an easy fix to it by simply, instead of adding the dry hops at the end, complete end of fermentation for a short period of dry hopping, we now add them at the very tail end of primary when yeast is still active and happy. We let the continual breakdown of starches occur in the tank. We let the yeast consume that before it goes to package. So that's how we've approached it here with this specific beer. But like I said, it's just every brewer is going to have to make their own decisions. They just need to understand that this is a real phenomenon that does happen.
And if I can piggyback on that and say I absolutely agree, the only way to know for sure how it's going to impact your beer is to make the beer and see how it's impacted. However, I will say we've got a lot of mileage out of a very simple experiment where you take the beer in question, the beer that you're going to dry hop, take a sample of it, split it into two, add your hops to one half of it and not to the other half, let it go for a couple of days or, whatever amount of time that you think is practical for the way you intend to use the hops, and use whatever gauge that if you're concerned about VDKs, then measure VDKs on both the dry hopped and the undry hopped. If you're concerned about ethanol production, CO2 production, and so on, measure it over time and compare just the differences. What do you see? Is it any different? Much easier than it is to do those experiments in production scale fermenters. I can tell you that.
To add to that, so we have some advantages at Bell's, I think, because of our process. Would certainly agree with what Tom said about when you adding your hops being very important to this. So we've certainly found that if you're adding your hops during a point in primary fermentation where the yeast is still very active, that this effect may be seen as part of the standard fermentation, I guess. We have some processes and some analytical checks along the way that clued us into this and that have been very helpful. One thing that hasn't been mentioned that I know in some of the experiments that Luke ran, some of the benchtop stuff was very clear, and an advantage we have as a brewery is that we centrifuge our beer. And it appears that when you remove the hops from the beer, that the phenomenon is stopped at that point. And, certainly in terms of carrying the phenomenon over to bottle and concerns of CO2 stability on the shelf, that appears to be a way to rectify the situation.
I have heard some discussion as this phenomenon has become a little bit more known out there. I've heard some suggestion by folks that a way to combat this would be to dry hop cold and package cold, etc. I would only caution against that if you dry hop cold, it doesn't stop the effect from happening. It doesn't stop from those starches being broken down into simple sugars. And then you go and package that beer. And even if you have a very small count of yeast, that beer is going to sit on a shelf somewhere, whether we like it or not. At somebody out there is going to sit out there. We've seen in another beer we did on a seasonal basis, completely centrifuged bright beer that was dry hopped, that in theory was bright, but in reality had maybe 100,000 cells per milliliter or 50,000 cells per milliliter in solution. We saw that this same effect of increased extract production in the package. It just took a really long time.
Yeah, I wanted to just chime in here about the residual after effect of the hop exposure. We've done some experiments with 4 different commercial breweries that make very hoppy beers, and it was really interesting to just have them send us samples of the beers that we then hung on to and looked at chromatographically over time for changes in the sugar composition. The real extract in none of these beers really changed much. The composition of that real extract changed, and changed quite considerably for some beers. So you got beer that has been packaged. In many cases, these are beers that have been centrifuged, and in some cases also filtered. So they have low levels of yeast, but the sugar concentration over time increases. We see the production of both maltose and glucose with several months of aging, or with accelerated aging, or even storage in under refrigerated conditions. And we also had a beer that we pasteurized alongside this, and we could see in the pasteurized beer these changes didn't occur, but in the ones that weren't pasteurized, these changes in residual extract did occur. So it's kind of reinforcing what Jason was saying. It sort of sets up the potential for some interesting safety concerns. It also sort of makes me scratch my head and wonder, are dry hopped beers that age, as the beers age, they tend to take on a more sweet-like quality, and I've always thought that was a reduction in bitterness, but who knows, maybe it's actually a production in sweetness. So
Interesting. This is the first I've heard that you see sugar production even in dry hopping in the cold. This is amazing. It's kind of telling me that the hop enzymatic activity
persists.
Essentially always going to be active under any sort of real world brewing conditions. However, the yeast metabolic activity, obviously that's only going to occur at yeast fermentation temperatures. Interesting.
Yeah, it's low level, but Luke, I'll show you some data in San Diego. So it's pretty cool.
Cool.
It sounds like most of the work here has been done with Cascade, which makes a lot of sense. Tom, how much, to what extent could there be a varietal component here? I mean, are different varieties going to have different enzyme contents?
Yeah, they do. But it's hard to tease out varietal difference versus agronomic growing differences versus kilning versus processing. So we just got done with a study looking at roughly 30 different commercial varieties that are commonly used for dry hopping, and found that there was indeed quite a variation in enzymatic activity, and within the enzymatic power, the nature of that enzymatic activity was different. Like, so in some cases, some hops produce more glucose, and other hops produce more maltose, and other hops produce more maltotriose, and but so the take home is that, okay, there is variability, but we also saw that there were some like year to year effects, and I think Luke has done something similar, although maybe not as big a varietal scan, but you've just published something that looked at different lots of Centennial, didn't you, Luke? And you saw some differences.
Yeah, we had been saving samples of Centennial, actual, production samples. I'd grab some, a few hundred grams, a couple of times a year, and had some that had been sitting, warm stored, basically at room temperature for a couple of years. And I always split the samples and, put half in the freezer and half room temp. So I had samples going back about 3 years old, of pairs of warm stored and frozen stored, and this was all Centennial. It's our one of our, we use more Centennial than any other variety, so it's of particular interest. And what we found, and so when we set up this sort of laboratory model where we take a certain amount of beer from a fermenter and add the hops in the lab, what we found was so we studied in one set all Centennial hops that were stored warm for 3 years to hops that had, essentially just been harvested and processed, super fresh hops to horribly abused, cheesy, nasty old hops. And what we found was, some differences, but not very significant differences compared to some earlier work we had done when we were looking at different, varieties of hops, or probably better said, different samples of hops representing different varieties. And, in that case, we found a sort of a wide range of activity. For example, like a Citra, we found almost no activity. It was sort of barely above control, but, barely above, zero. Whereas consistently we found our samples of Amarillo and Cascade to have a much greater activity. And sort of the range of differences that we saw with these different, fresh samples of hops of different varieties were much bigger differences than what we saw with, 3 years of warm storage of Centennial, which sort of tells me there's a that this activity is relatively very stable compared to, the aroma properties of hops. There's no way in the world you'd consider using 3-year-old warm stored hops to, dry hop well, at least not an American IPA, because all the flavor molecules and whatnot are going to be completely gone. But this activity will still be there to some degree, for whatever that's worth.
That was Tom Shellhammer from OSU, Jason Perkins from Allagash, and Luke Chadwick and Andy Farrell from Bell's Brewery. Keep listening for more resources on Hop Creep, or just have a beer with these guys at the upcoming Brewing Summit. I'm really looking forward to the ASBC MBAA Brewing Summit coming up this August in San Diego. It only happens every 4 years, and it's not like any other conference you've attended. The Brewing Summit is 100% the science and technology of brewing. No pep rallies or business lectures, and you'll be surrounded by some of the smartest men and women in our industry. If you can only attend one conference in 2018, this should be it. Register now at mbaa.com.
Just like that one day when we came around there. Since there's that one day.
I should give a plug to Luke, because I think, Luke, you're presenting at ASBC, correct?
True. Yeah, I'm presenting at ASBC. You've probably verbal skills are like my weakest skills, and I swear if you read the paper that we published, you'll get a much better story than what I've just told you. So I would like to sort of plug that if possible. It's to me way more clearly explained than anything that I said in this interview.
Sounds good. And where can people find that paper?
That's in the Journal of the American Society of Brewing Chemists. Actually, I just realized if you Google the freshening power of hops, it was the first hit as of a couple of days ago anyway. So check that out.
Nice. That's a pretty good search engine optimization you got going on there.
Right?
Cool. All right, guys. Well, everybody have a good one, and I look forward to having a beer with you soon.
Cool.
All right.
Sure.
See you in San Diego.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Head on the floor. Just like that first time when we came to town, girl. And then there's one thing that I should have said.